When I was in my teens, my father bought a house in the country. It was a newer house, built in the 70s, I believe. The neighbors weren't too close by, except for a house right at the end of the driveway. A little background. The previous owners were a husband and a wife. The house at the end of the driveway belonged to the mom of one of them, but I can't remember which. The husband found out he had cancer. He kept spiraling further and further into depression as the disease progressed. One day, he decided that he was done. And, as the story goes, he set up tarps in the dining room right in front of the patio and patio door, and shot himself. His wife proceeded to move out, and the house was put up for sale. The buyer of that house was my dad. The house was quite big, complete with a nice finished basement that was pretty roomy. My room was upstairs, the first bedroom of 3 up there, down the hallway. It was enjoyable at first. Got to decorate my new room. As a teenager, I had an obscene amount of posters, pictures, and drawings. I used them as decorations. I stuck them all over to the wall that had the closet in it. For a while it was great, but it didn't take very long for things to start getting weird. Now mind you, at this stage I had no knowledge of the previous owner or the house's history. One of the first odd things I noticed was that I would wake up, like clockwork, every night at around 2 a.m. I thought it was strange, but I would just roll over and go back to sleep. Then, in the mornings when I would wake up, the posters on the wall would be crooked. Being a typical teenager, I couldn't be bothered, so I'd leave them crooked for a few days. But then eventually, I would straighten them back up, retack them, and give up eventually. Then I started to notice that every single poster was tilted at the exact same angle, facing the same direction. Again, I thought it was weird, so I taped up all the posters the way they were, all 4 corners, the way I had them originally. And still, no matter what I did, the posters would end up at the same angle, facing the same way. Eventually, I gave up and just left them that way. Remember how I said that I would consistently wake up at 2 a.m.? Eventually, that started to freak me out. The longer it went on, the stranger I thought it was. It got to the point where I was so anxious about waking up at 2 a.m. that it took me longer to fall asleep afterward, which took a toll on my sleep quality. But that's when the real fun started. At that point, I began to hear footsteps. They began on the basement stairs. Then they would ascend the stairs, open the basement door, and walk through the kitchen. After that, they'd go down the hallway directly past my door, turn at the end, and go back into the basement. The first time I heard it, I thought it was my dad. Of course, I thought that was a weird thing for him to do, but I was still convinced it was just him, until I heard him snoring in the other room. That's when I panicked. My blankets went up over my head, and I basically hyperventilated, honestly expecting my door to fly open or something. But the door didn't open. I never saw a ghost when it happened, and obviously I didn't die, but man, did that freak me out. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, as soon as my dad woke up, I told him what I'd heard. He laughed at me. Okay, sure, you must have had some kind of dream. And that was that. He had zero belief in the paranormal. In hindsight, the messed up thing is that he knew the history of the house, and I didn't. So I went on believing that sure, maybe it was a fluke, or a waking dream, or maybe I'm just crazy, onward. I still woke up nearly every night at 2 a.m. on the dot, but for a while I didn't hear the footsteps. All good, right? Wrong. The footsteps were sporadic, but they did come back. At least once or twice a month I would hear the footsteps trace the same path through the house, up the basement stairs, opening the door, through the house, and back into the basement. I just about had a panic attack every single time, but I knew that telling my dad about it was pointless. I told him the first 4 or 5 times they happened, but once I got tired of being laughed at and dismissed, I gave up. The only saving grace I had was that whatever owned the steps at night never came into my room, and I was more than happy if it stayed that way. We had been there for about 5 or 6 months, when one day my father was outside talking to the lady who lived at the end of the drive. She was always in the backyard picking her blackberries, and while she did, my dad was outside talking to her. When he came back in, he said, "Okay, I have something to tell you." I sat down with him at the table. He then proceeded to tell me the story of the house, the way the man died there, everything. He ends the story by saying, "And then the lady at the end of the drive and I were talking today, and she told me she's seen our lights come on in the dining room when none of us were here. She thinks it's her dead relative haunting the place." For a moment, I felt pure elation. I thought, finally, he believes me. So you can imagine my dismay when he starts laughing and says, "You and the old lady have good imaginations." Even when he checked the wiring for our lights and found no issues, he refused to believe that anything paranormal was going on. The lights never came on or went off by themselves while I was home, but plenty of other things happened. Random doors would open and close on their own. Has to be drafts of wind, right? That's what my dad thought. Me? Not so much. The laundry room was in the basement, and I hated it down there. I always felt like someone was watching me. Every time I'd walk down the stairs to enter the basement, it felt like someone was nudging me along, right at my heels. I started to hate that basement. Flash forward a year or so. I had a boyfriend, and after a while, he started spending the night. After a bit, he looks at my wall and goes, "Hey, why are all of your posters crooked?" I sighed. "Because every single time I straighten them, they always end up like this in the morning, so eventually I just left them that way." He looks at me and goes, "No way," and starts laughing. More of a nervous laugh than one of disbelief. So, me being me, I went out and got some pretty good packing tape. I handed him a roll too and told him to start helping me put the corners up, to make sure that they were really straight and very secure. We finished up and I said, "Are you certain that these are all straight and that they're securely fastened to the wall?" He goes, "Yep, absolutely." I think he thought we were having fun. I don't think he expected anything to happen. So when we woke up in the morning to find that every single picture was back, hanging at an angle exactly as they had been before we fixed them, he about shit himself. However, this event was something of a turning point, because at least I finally had someone on my side who believed that something weird was happening. I started to tell him everything else that had been going on in the house, including the footsteps. "You have to wake me up when you hear them," he said. And so, when they happened again when he was sleeping over, I tried to wake him up. Boy, how I tried. Several times this happened, and no matter how loud I said his name or how violently I tried to shake him awake, he would never wake up when the noises happened. One day the two of us were hanging out in the living room when the big wooden basement doors began violently shaking. They shook so hard I could feel it vibrating the living room floor. These were two solid, heavy wooden doors underneath the patio that opened up to a little garage big enough to park your car in. They were not little flimsy doors at all. There was even a pheasant nearby that made a racket and flew away in a panic when this started happening. My boyfriend and I both jumped, thinking that someone was trying to break into the house. We ran outside and circled the property, trying to find out what was happening, all the while still hearing the doors pounding away. There was nothing. Well, nothing except two teenagers and a pheasant that had all been scared shitless. We both told my dad when he came home. It had to be obvious how scared we were, and my dad, knowing the property, would also know that there was no way for someone to get away fast enough for us to not hear or see them when we went outside to check, especially since the noise was still happening while we were looking. My dad dismissed us as over-exaggerating teenagers that were making too much out of a little tremble from a breeze. Even he had to have known better than that. But he refused to believe us. My dad had this old wooden rocking chair in the corner of the dining room. Some more time passed, and this thing starts rocking back and forth on its own. It rocked slowly and consistently, as though someone was sitting in it. I told my dad. His solution was to buy a rug for it, and said it was those damn drafts again. Still, the thing would rock. But of course it never did when my father was around, and this was before we had cell phones that we could whip out and record things with. Well, we had cell phones, but they were very much lacking in video quality. Mine didn't have video capability at all. Eventually, I got so sick of dealing with the ongoing activity and my dad's dismissive attitude that my boyfriend and I got an apartment of our own and I moved out. And that should have been the end of the story, right? I thought so too. But I was wrong. My boyfriend and I moved out, and eventually my dad got a new girlfriend who moved in. This woman had 2 children. One was my father's, and one was a child she had with another man. Both kids were very young at the time, the girl being around 5 years old, and the other one being around 2. Some time passes without incident, but then his girlfriend starts talking to me and asking questions about the house. She told me that something was really off, and I made sure that she was aware of the house's history, which she said she was. Here's where shit gets really scary. Her daughter's room was my old bedroom. You know, the one with the poster-hating poltergeist? That one. Well, one day the girlfriend sits me down and tells me this story. Her daughter came down to breakfast one day, and as they're all sitting around, she looks at her mom and goes, "Have you met Zabu?" Slightly confused, the girlfriend says, "No, honey, who's Zabu?" Her daughter responds, "He's scary. He's an old man who lives in my closet. He has a long beard, and he glows green." She pauses and looks solemn for a second and says, "I've only seen him a couple times, but I don't like him. I don't like my closet either." Already alarmed by what her daughter is saying, she opens her mouth to ask questions, and that's when her son, who's only 2, remember, stares up at the ceiling and says, "I don't want to talk to you right now." Nobody was speaking to him. He was within line of sight, but he was in a completely different area from where she and her daughter were having a conversation. The girlfriend continued to tell me stories about her kids' experiences, as well as her own. I even contacted a local paranormal team to ask if they would be interested in investigating, and they said they would be. Unfortunately, they needed the permission of the owner of the home. While my dad's girlfriend was all for it, we asked my dad, and he said he didn't want a bunch of strangers staying in his house just to investigate some nonsense. Fast forward a few years. She and my dad broke up, and she had moved out. He got a new job, and due to the job requirements, he was almost never home. He had to go away for weeks, sometimes months at a time. At this point, I had 2 children, so when my dad asked if me and my boyfriend wanted to rent the place while he was gone on business, I figured, why not? It would only be while he was away for a long stay, and it would be nice for my kids to have more room and roam in the meantime. As you might imagine, several incidents occurred. The first thing that happened was late one night when I was in the basement. The lighting down there is pretty dim, but I could hear something rustling around in one of the 2 bedrooms that exist in the basement area. I opened the door, and the light wouldn't come on. Nothing paranormal here, just a blown bulb. But as I was looking around for what I thought were rodents, something on the ceiling caught my eye. All over there were these flashing green and red-orange lights. The closest thing I can compare it to is a flashing smoke alarm light, but there were hundreds of them, all over the place. I closed the door and backed out of there, vacating the basement altogether. From that point out, those lights would randomly appear on the ceiling in the main basement area too. Then my sister and her boyfriend came to visit. Once again, we were down in the basement. We preferred to smoke down there so as not to fill the main area of the home with the smell. It was getting pretty late, and my sister's boyfriend decided that he'd open the car bay door from inside the house and go outside to relieve himself. It's easy enough for him, I suppose, and he didn't want to wake my kids by going upstairs to use the bathroom. So anyway, he's heading through the door, and all of a sudden we hear this loud, "What the fuck?" He turned around and hightailed it back to where we were, slamming the door. He was obviously panicked, and it took us a while to get him to calm down and tell us what he saw. Finally, he goes, There's a girl in there. I saw a little girl run across the room, like from one end to the other." We went in to check it out, but of course nothing was there, and my kids were perfectly tucked away in bed, fast asleep. Plus, if one of them had been running around, we would have heard them coming down the stairs and opening doors to get to the space where my sister's boyfriend was, and we certainly would have heard them run all the way through the house and upstairs in their attempt to get back to bed had they been playing a prank. One night, well after dark, I was in my bedroom upstairs. Not my old room where the posters used to fall, but one that I had chosen to stay in once we got back in. Nobody was staying in the room where both I and my dad's ex-girlfriend's daughter had experienced paranormal activity. However, my new room was adjacent to the old one. I was folding some laundry, just going about my regular business, when my daughter, who was about 3 or 4 years old at the time, said, "Mommy, who's the man standing outside?" I looked out the window, but there wasn't anyone there. Trying to stay calm, I said, "There's nobody there, babe." She points and says, "Yes, there is. He's right there." I still couldn't see anybody, so as calmly as I could, I moved her from the window and went to another room. "What does the man look like?" I asked. "He's tall and old, has a beard." "Remember Zabu?" "Yeah, me too." I couldn't believe it. I made sure to secure the curtains in her bedroom so they were always closed from that point on. On another day, I was in the living room playing Guitar Hero, sitting in a chair not too far away from the television. It was dark out and my kids were in bed. I was into the game and pretty focused, watching all the colors go by and playing along as best I could. Suddenly, I saw a little girl out of the corner of my eye, standing just a few feet from me. I thought it was my daughter and figured she had gotten out of bed to use the bathroom or something. I didn't look away from the game, but I said, "Hey sweetie, what do you need?" No response. "Are you thirsty or hungry?" No reply. "You should really go back to bed, it's late." Still nothing. I could still see her in my periphery. The song ended, so I looked in the direction of where she was, but there was nobody there. My daughter, who I thought I'd been talking to, was still in bed, sound asleep. I was in complete shock. Apparently, we had Zabu and a little girl just casually hanging around. Great. On another early morning, I was in the basement doing laundry. My boyfriend was sitting on the couch with our daughter. The couch was in front of a built-in bar area, 70s style. There was fluorescent lighting all over it, but none of it worked. The plug was behind the bar area, but we'd never bothered with it since, like I said, none of the lighting worked properly anyway. As I'm coming back down the stairs, I saw something I couldn't explain. I shouted to my boyfriend and the kids, "Watch out, get up!" They got out of the way just in time. The lamp that was on the bar was literally sliding across the bar at a high rate of speed, about to go straight off the edge and onto the heads of the people sitting under it, those people being my family. As soon as they all jumped up, it stopped moving and hovered on the edge of the bar. Other random incidents happened as well. For instance, my dad had this old phone that was screwed into the basement wall. When I say old, I mean it was probably installed when the house was built. It had a rotary dial and everything. Nobody used it. He'd just never taken it down. And of course it wasn't hooked up anymore. In any case, we didn't even have a landline. Our cell phones weren't exactly walking photography labs like they are now, but to make phone calls they were still far more convenient than having a home phone. Well, as you've probably figured out, every once in a while we'd be upstairs and that phone would start ringing. It's been years since there was a hookup to that line. It would only ring once or twice and then it would stop. And it never happened when someone was in the basement. We'd also hear random scratching on the carport door that almost sounded like a cat. If we were downstairs, it would be on the inside door heading to the carport, but on the car bay outside. Of course, upon investigation, there was never anybody or anything there, and nothing was ever disturbed or out of place. We stayed there about 6 or 7 months before I had finally had enough. Once again, I told my father all that had happened, and once again he told me that I was foolish and childish and that there were no such thing as ghosts. To each their own, I guess. He can believe whatever he wants, but it doesn't change the fact that I wasn't going to stay there anymore. Well, a few months after I moved out, my dad had gotten back from his business trip, and I got a frantic phone call. All he kept repeating was, "Okay, I believe you. I believe you now." The call came at a random time in the middle of the day, so I was a little confused. "Believe me about what?" I asked. "About the ghosts. There's something in this house." "Well, you don't say." I asked him what happened. He said that he was laying on the couch at night late. Remember, he was the only one living there at this point, so he knew he was completely alone. All of a sudden, the cupboard doors in the kitchen started opening and slamming shut, all on their own. On another night, a mug fell out of the cupboard all by itself, like came from the back of the cupboard and tumbled out of it. like it had been slid out and dropped. The taps began to turn on and off by themselves. And then, he says one night he swears he saw somebody walking around outside. He went outside to investigate, but nobody was there. He figured it was his imagination, but this was before the cupboard incident. I asked him who he saw outside, and he said it was a tall, older man with a beard. He was pretty shaken up, but he had to leave for an extended work trip again soon. He rented the house out to a few different people, and he even warned them about the house. Most didn't believe him. Only one of the renters admitted to him that they had seen some pretty weird stuff too. He never elaborated on what happened with the renters, but after the last renter left, he put the house up for sale. This was all about 5 years ago, and I've always wondered what became of the house, and about the stories the current owners probably have. I don't know who they are though, and I'm not about to drive up there to find out, no matter how tempting it might be. I've had other inexplicable events happen to me over the years, but living in this house was the craziest thing I've ever been through. It was quite an experience. My grandfather's property, which I grew up on, was pretty crazy. Here is the story of a strange encounter that I've had on that very haunted and maybe even cursed property. At 16 years old, I was responsible for getting my 7-year-old sister on the bus for school. I always had to get her dressed, fed, and tie her hair up in a ponytail. One morning I was very sick, but I got her up as usual and got her off to school. I was super nauseated and laid on the couch with a trash can next to me because I couldn't stop vomiting. The TV was playing some cartoon on Disney, and I had my arm covering my eyes as I laid there. I was dozing off as I heard my sister come into the living room and say, "Sissy, will you tie my hair up?" Not really thinking about it, my eyes still covered, I held out my hand, waiting for her to place the hair tie in my palm. Whatever the thing was must have realized that it couldn't give me what I was asking for, and about that same time I realized that I had already gotten my sister on the bus, and that whatever was standing next to me talking to me wasn't my sister at all, but it had her voice. As I sat up, spooked as all hell, the damn thing ran off, and I could hear its footsteps running through the kitchen and down the hallway. I didn't see anything, no apparition, just sounds. I dragged myself to my grandmother's house about a block away, and shortly after that I moved in with her because my mother and I couldn't get along. That's another story. Weird things like that happened all the time on that property, but I certainly didn't expect anything to follow me to my grandmother's. 2 weeks after moving in, I was in my room with the door cracked. I was home alone, and it was late. My brother, who was 15 at the time, was always at the neighbor's house and would stop in to shower, eat, and sleep. I heard him come in, go into his room and fiddle around with something, and I could hear him talking like he was on the phone with someone. I called for him and he didn't respond, so I assumed he was just pranking me. I got up and left my room, and his bedroom door across the hall was closed and locked. I stuck my thumbnail into the keyhole and popped it open, planning to scare him. When I opened the door, his lights were off. His room was completely dark and empty. I flipped the light on and started investigating. I opened the closet, I looked under the desk, I even assumed he went out the window and was going to come back in and scare me. But when I checked the window, it was bolted down, something my grandmother had done to keep him from sneaking out. I was perplexed, and then spooked. I left his room to go check the rest of the house, and as I was walking down the hallway and into the living room, I heard someone running hard behind me. As I turned around, this nothing ran right through me and took my breath away. I fell to the floor, feeling like I had gotten socked in the gut. When I came to, I ran next door to find my brother passed out on the couch with his friends. It was an absolutely terrifying experience, and one that I will always remember. I don't know what this thing was, but it mimicked my siblings perfectly. Their voices, their footsteps, their actions, everything. This is a true story. When I was a teenager, my family moved into a new house in Ohio. Well, it was new to us. The house itself was kind of old. As soon as we moved in, my mother started saying that she felt like the house was haunted and that she could sense a presence there. She said she heard somebody call her name and that she felt someone put a hand on her shoulder. One time she woke up with somebody holding her feet down, and she couldn't shake whatever it was off, and she started screaming. She also heard muffled voices. We didn't believe her at first, not at all, until both my sister and I started experiencing strange things. My first experience was when I was reading a book in my bedroom at 3 a.m. I'm a night owl, and it wasn't that unusual for me to do. Everyone should have been asleep, but suddenly I heard very heavy footsteps right outside my bedroom door. They were too heavy to be my mom's or my sister's, so I just assumed my dad was walking around checking up on us. I sprinted to the door, and when I opened it, I was shocked to discover the hallway was dark and nobody was up. Our attic had several feet of fluffy insulation covering the entire area. There was nothing stored there, and at times you could hear steps coming from the attic running up to the side of the house with the driveway when somebody was pulling up to the house, as if to see who had arrived. It was almost cool in the daytime, but terrifying at night. There was something always clicking loudly under my bed and in the closet at night too, and I always tried to convince myself that it was just the air vents. However, all of the air vents were on the other side of the bedroom, and they never clicked. I sometimes saw an outline of a person standing next to my bed if my head was covered with a sheet, but when I pulled the sheet off, nobody would be there. I could hear sighs as if somebody was standing right behind me, and one time I heard a whisper say, "Come play." I prayed a lot, and that usually helped. I would also ask them directly to quiet down, and that helped as well. One time my boyfriend and I were doing homework in the basement and heard the garage door open and the voices of my parents in the kitchen. We ran up just to say hi, only to discover an empty house. Another time my boyfriend stayed overnight in our house. He slept in the living room. In the morning he asked us why we had been playing a joke on him all night, but we didn't know what he meant. He said that he kept hearing a ball bounce on the stairwell leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor and in the kitchen, but every time he got up to see what was going on, nobody was there. I don't think we even owned a ball, and we certainly didn't play with one in the house. One time my mom heard a baby cry outside of our house at night. We lived in a safe and perfectly normal suburb, and there was no reason that a baby would be in our backyard. One day a lid flew off a cooking pot and got halfway embedded into the kitchen ceiling. It wasn't a pressure cooker or anything, it was just a regular lid and a pot. There was nothing that should have caused it to do that. On another occasion we left for a family vacation, and my boyfriend was asked to take our paper in. He said that he was in the house and decided to make my bed. We left at some ungodly hour of 5 a.m., and I never got to it. He said at first he got a juice and felt like somebody was breathing down his neck at the refrigerator. He kept turning around to find nobody there. Then he walked upstairs, and while he was making my bed, he felt somebody grab his legs from under it. He got freaked out and ran out. He refused to enter the house again, and just diligently hid the papers behind a flower pot until we returned. One night my sister woke up to a black caped figure standing silently in her room. She said there was also a bright orb near her window. Her windows faced the backyard and the trees, and being on the second floor, there was no possible source of light from cars and other things. She covered her head with a blanket, and when she looked out, the figure and the orb were still there. She went back under the blanket, and after some time they had finally gone. One day our cat disappeared without a trace too. I can't be sure if it was related or not, but it happened. My dad was one person who never experienced anything. No voices, no steps, no TV and radios blasting out on their own. He is hard of hearing, so that could have been a factor. But one thing he can't explain is waking up at 4 a.m. next to a lit tea light candle. He swears it burnt out at midnight. The candle was right in front of his face, and he's extremely sensitive to light, to the point where he covers any electronics at night with napkins as they disturb his sleep. It eventually got so bad that I refused to sleep in my own bedroom, as I could feel someone move around in the room at night, and I slept in my sister's room. My dad decided to call a medium one day. The guy said that there were 5 spirits in the house: a boy, an old lady, a couple, and a very angry man. He gave us a giant candle with a cross on it and said to burn it in the bedroom of the youngest child. which now was also my bedroom where I slept in a sofa chair. The candle was in a big glass jar and was hefty. It was difficult even to pick up. All night it kept shaking, and the glass kept making clicking noises against the counter it stood on. We were also to tell the spirits that this was our house now and that they needed to go to the light. Things improved after the visit, and shortly after I moved out to attend college, where I slept for years with the lights on, even though I never experienced any paranormal activity in my apartment there. After college, I never stayed in the house for longer than a few days, always sleeping with the lights on, as the creepy feeling remained, although nothing notable happened anymore. Eventually, my parents sold the house, and I was never so glad to see it go.